Hello, I'm Paul Beckwith, and I'm continuing my discussions on the horrific devastation in the Bahamas and how ridiculous the reporting has been of the death tolls. And if you just work backwards from the number of people on these islands, Grand Bahama and Abaco Island, the populations of these places, and look at the number of people that have been, fed, 20,000 people fed, several thousand going off to the U.S., people going to other islands, some people staying on the islands, but the numbers don't make any sense that have been reported. And as I mentioned in the previous video, the Bahama papers were estimating 3,000 people missing, so presumed dead because being washed out to sea mostly from the high storm surges, 3,000 in Abaco Island and 3,000 in just some of the low-lying areas like mud flats of the Grand Bahama Island. So putting all of this together, I mean, my best guess now would be we're talking, maybe 30 to 40,000 people missing, drowned, washed out to sea. And if you just count bodies on the ground, these people will never be identified because their bodies have just been washed out to sea. There's nothing left on the shore, no sign of that they ever existed. So, this is horrifying. As horrifying it is, we need to deal with reality and facts, and I just don't see that in the reporting. So I'm talking also about, about rebuilding. Should we rebuild? They will rebuild, but how should they do it to try to make the Bahamas, or in fact all of the Caribbean islands, more resilient? So I was suggesting that, the idea of something like cruise ships is vital for resiliency of these places because they can house thousands of people, they can help in relief efforts, they can move people off the islands quickly should another big hurricane come along. Remember 2 years ago, I mean, there were multiple hurricanes following similar paths. Okay, there are tropical disturbance and tropical storms forming right now as we speak. Hopefully they don't follow a similar path to Dorian. So I was talking about the necessity of cruise ships for relief efforts, of cruise ships for transporting people from island to island. And these things could also be operated as cruise ships for tourists. They can bring, I think they should have more than three. They can, the cruise ship industry is owned by large corporations that are based, on mainlands, but it makes more sense for those profits to go to the Caribbean islands. So I have no idea why they don't buy their own cruise ships and pay them off over time from the tourism. They can run the industry. They could even, if they want, basically, well, they'd allow other cruise ships to come on land, but I mean they have an advantage because they always have the option to limit the number of other cruise ships so that if people want to take a cruise ship to the Caribbean, they have to take a cruise ship that's owned by one of the Caribbean islands. So I think they should buy more, and they should employ survivors as crew, survivors of these islands as crew to immediately, give them jobs, start paying passengers from U.S. ports and other ports around the world to actually come to these islands and see the destruction. People will be, completely dismayed by all of the destruction, seeing it firsthand, and they can donate a lot of money and they can help fix it, and they can become part of the process. They can become intertwined with these islands, okay, rather than just donating from afar. It's a bit different for people to see the destruction. So it may seem weird to bring cruise boats to the destroyed islands, but that would help the world understand level of destruction, bring funds to Bermuda to help pay off the ships, get survivors back on their feet with purpose and jobs, greatly increase aid donations. The guiding principle for all Bahamas islands, in fact, all Caribbean islands, is resiliency and hardening. How can these places be strengthened? Key infrastructure like power stations, power supply, power lines, storm shelters on high ground, have to be all major considerations, really when the rebuilding is done. Now, I read a fascinating book, and it's actually called Seasteading, not seascaping, but Seasteading by Joe Quirk. Ironic last name. The idea is that people live on the sea in huge, perhaps modular ship residences anchored to islands. Hurricane comes, you just move out of the way. Sea level rises, no problem. Okay, so think deeply about this. I mean, it sounds absolutely ridiculous, but if you use these islands as preserves with pristine forests and pristine water, and use them to grow crops and to have, be nature preserves for tourists, right? You could have the cruise ships anchored and the food could be supplied and water supplied from the island. A hurricane's coming along, you just move the cruise ships out of the way with the population and move back when the hurricane has passed, and you don't have, you don't get your island trashed basically by a hurricane. Sea level doesn't bother you so much. Okay, as sea level continues to rise and your islands essentially disappear, well, you could at least be anchored to where you were before, and at least have a sense of place for a little while, before you move on to some other place. But you're mobile, and you can be resilient and deal with these hurricanes. Right now the Bahamas is setting up staging sites on the destroyed islands for thousands of survivors in temporary shelters for rebuilding efforts. That's fine as long as another hurricane doesn't come along soon. Like I said, buying cruise ships gives you quick evacuation ability. You don't have to rely on other nations to bail you out. As it turns out, as climate change gets worse and worse and worse, people need to have their own resilience, and they can't rely on other nations for help. Okay, so these are some of the ideas moving forward that I have. If you go to Google Earth, I tweeted out this link where you can actually focus in on, they've updated the satellite images of some of the devastation of these islands. You've all seen the pictures, but I mean, with Category 5 winds, there's lots of places that were just completely ripped out. Houses completely gone down to the concrete bases that they're sitting on. What is amazing to me is the number of structures that survived. So, a lot of it is not a fluke, right? Part of it is, flying debris from other people's houses can take years out building, but there are buildings which seem to have survived fairly well. So we need to find out why. A lot of them, there can be some quirky flukes, but also, designing very, very strong buildings and have roofs that will not fly off, whether they be metal roofs, completely part of the structure, concrete roofs or whatever. We really need to look at how to make buildings withstand the type of winds that were experienced, at least for critical infrastructure like power stations, etc. Now let's have a look at what happened a couple of years ago. So 2 years ago, right, it was September 2017. All of these hurricanes hitting Puerto Rico, hitting lots of other islands. Okay, there were 1,600 people on an island of Barbuda, which is part of Antigua. The country of, Antigua, Barbuda, the two islands are part of a country. 1,600 inhabitants. They had to abandon the island after the hurricane hit. Irma annihilated Barbuda. Okay, the damage is complete, the ambassador said. Some 95% of the island's homes and businesses were damaged or destroyed by Irma. For the first time in 300 years, there's not a single living person on the island of Barbuda. A civilization that has existed on that island for over 300 years has now been extinguished. So they evacuated everybody after Irma went through. And then a full 24 days after Irma struck, the evacuation order was lifted. the island had gone feral, but the locals weren't flocking back. The locals were not allowed to go back. They let in people to rebuild. They let in people to start constructing some new infrastructure, but they did not let the locals back in. So what happened? What was that about? So, here's the, after Irma, Caribbean tourism, island by island. So they talk about, 185 mile per hour winds, sustained wind, same as with Dorian. And they talk about, all the islands that were hit, and then, like, of course, Puerto Rico was most in the news. And they talked about, Barbuda, how it was completely devastated, complete destruction, evacuate the island. These are some images. Barbuda is a wasteland. Dominica is devastated. Puerto Rico has no power. Psychic storms in 2017. More images. Post-apocalyptic landscapes in Barbuda. Here's the path of Irma right through. Okay, this is Maria, which went through Puerto Rico. Jose up this way. We've had the first major storm of 2019. Hopefully it's not a repeat of 2017. But these storms are, here's a house in Barbuda, and just total devastation. So what happened afterwards? I think these are also images of Barbuda. That hurricane didn't linger. Like, it went through the island, did its damage. The damage was much, much worse in the Bahamas. Okay, this is a little bit about the island. If you go to the wiki for Barbuda, you can see 1638 residents. Most lived in this one town, biggest town on Barbuda. And then the Hurricane Irma destroyed 95% of the island's buildings and structure. All of the island's inhabitants were evacuated to Antigua, leaving Barbuda empty for the first time in modern history. So they talk about the history of the island and the devastation. Okay, so what happened in the rebuilding? So this article from September 2018, so just over a year from when Irma hit, shows shows some of the damage right after the hurricane. So China stepped in to help rebuild. The West was accused of benign neglect. Okay, so China was put in $2 million, 1.5 million pound. Beijing donated it for repairs. Western countries basically were accused of neglect in the cleanup operation. Okay, so they signed agreements with China because the West would not help them. Okay, so after Irma, disaster capitalism threatens cultural heritage of Bermuda. So this is an article from February of this year. And basically it talks about this is well worth reading. So after Irma, disaster capitalism threatens cultural heritage of Bermuda. Have a look at that article if you want to know about the rebuilding efforts in Barbuda. Okay, basically, in summary, disaster capitalism took an immediate hold after the disaster, and that's the idea that wealthy elites exploit the crisis to reap profits and deepen inequality while affected populations are still in shock. So they moved the people from Barbuda to Antigua, and then even residents that wanted to stay were not allowed to stay. So they evacuated them. They were away for weeks and weeks, went on to 6 weeks because health officials didn't give them clearance, but they let the military, aid organizations, and airport developers go on Barbuda immediately after the hurricane and start rebuilding in their way with no input from the people that lived there. 4 months later, they let people return home, and basically they lost a say in how the place was developed. The local people were basically shoved aside. And you can read this article here. This just came out September 8th, and it has the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda interviewed and talking about the rebuilding after the hurricane. suggesting things for the Bahamas. So thank you for listening.